today's shir, we're going to be discussing the halachos of Hamshocho. Hamshachas mayim shuvim is a halacha that we came across quite a few times already, up until what we're holding now. We're going to be learning today Sif Mem Daled in Halachos Mikvois. We already came across the term of Hamshocho in Sif Daled the first time, talking about a mikveh beveis goy. You have a mikveh in the house of a goy, and you want to know if you could trust him, that he's not tampering with the water and causing it to become pasul, she'uvin. So the halacha was that if there's 21 saw already, and if the only way that the goy could put in more water would be through hamshaka, that would be okay. That was the first time we came across the term hamshaka. And we explained then that hamshaka means that even after water becomes pasul, whether it's a psul of she'uvin or other psulim, whether it's haviyos betumah, tfisis idei adam, there's a way to make it kosher again. You can make water kosher again, that it should be roi for a mikveh. How is that? By using what's called hamshaka. Hamshaka would mean dragging, literally. You drag the water, you let the water flow on the ground, and now it becomes kosher again. That was the first time we saw the idea of hamshaka. We saw it again in Sif Tezvov and Lamates, regarding when somebody brings water, not with a keli, but by hand, or the hands and feet of animals. If hamshaka would help that as well, to be kosher to water. In Sif Lamadvav, about tzinoiris, many times we came across the idea of hamshachas mayim she'uvin, making mayim she'uvin kosher again. Now, in Sif Mem Daled, this is actually where we learn the most important and most basic conditions when hamshaka works, what kind of she'uvin and how much she'uvin could be kosher using hamshaka. And in the next two sifim, Sif Mem Hey and Mem Vav, that's where the Shulchan Aruch talks about how hamshaka is performed. Where could it be made? How much does the water have to flow? And the details of hamshachas mayim she'uvin. But in today's shir and Sif Mem Daled, we're going to learn the basic condition. How much water could you make hamshaka on? How much water becomes kosher? When could it be used? And things like that. So we're going to start with just looking at the makoiros, as we usually do. There's a Mishna in Mikvois. Interestingly, the halacha of hamshaka is brought down quite a few times. Most seifim, most halachas and mikvois are brought down either in a Mishnah or in a Gemara or a Tosefta. The halachas of hamshaka are brought down in the Mishnah and a Gemara and a Tosefta. And there's quite a few contradictions. There's quite a few different ways of understanding how hamshaka really works. And there's a machlekes Rishonim, which the B'si Yosef talks about at length. How do we interpret these Mishnahs and the conditions of hamshaka? So the first makor that we're going to be talking about is a Mishnah. The Mishnah in Perek Dal, Mishnah Daled in Mikvois. Mayim she'uvim u'meik shomim shnes'arhu b'chotzer u'be'uka va'almailis hamara. If you have mayim she'uvim and meik shomim that mix together, they're flowing together, they're heading toward a mikveh, and they're mixing together, kosher and pasul water. Im roiv mana kosher. If most of the water that's flowing is kosher, and only a miyat is pasul, then as it flows together into the mikveh, that's kosher. Vim roiv mana pasul. If most of it is pasul water, then even the fact that they're flowing together, and there's some kind of hamshaka taking place, it's pasul. And mechze, if it's half and half, the same amount of kosher and the same amount of pasul, that as well, the Mishnah says, is pasul. Eimesai, b'zman shemes arvim ad shelo yagiu lemikveh. This is true when the waters are mixing before they come to the mikveh. Hoye mekalchem b'toich hamayim, if the water is flowing directly into the water. Im yedua shenafel letoicha aboam so mayim ksherim ad shelo yorad letoicha shloisha lugen mayim she'uvim. If hamshaka is not being performed correctly, and it's a bit unclear what the Mishnah means about why it's not being performed correctly, but if it's not being performed correctly, then if you don't have 40 saw of mayim ksherim before 3 lugn of mayim shuvim enter, that would be a problem. So only if you know that there were already 40 saw of mayim ksherim before 3 lugn came in, that's when it's kosher. Vim lav, pasul. We learned already in Sif Tezvav that 3 lugn of mayim shuvim will cause a mikveh chseira to become pasul. So in this Mishnah we see one scenario of hamshaka, which is that if water that's kosher and pasul mix together and they flow together toward a mikveh, that's okay, as long as roiv of the water was the mayim ksherim. That was one makor to the idea of hamshaka. Like I said, there's different opinions in the Rishonim how to explain the reisha and the seifa, under what conditions does it work and when does it not work, but that's the basic idea and the basic source of hamshaka in the Mishnah and Mikvois. Then we have a Gemara in Temura. But the Gemara says, Rabbi ben Yaakov oimer, mikveh sheyesh boi etzer ba'achas saw meik shomim. You have a mikveh that has in it 21 saw of meik shomim, kosher water. Roiv of the mem saw, kosher water. Memala bekatif, one could manually fill water using shuvim. He could fill that mikveh to sha esrei saw upoiskan lemikveh. He could fill with kalim, real mayim shuvim, 19 saw of possible water because he filled it with kalim. Upoiskan lemikveh. He could open it and let it flow into the mikveh. Using the idea of hamshaka, he's letting 19 saw of shuvim flow into a mikveh chasera that has already in it 21 saw. Why? So the Lashon Gemara is shiva mitaheres b'rebiyah u'b'hamshaka. Shiva works. You could use mayim shuvim as long as you have a rebiyah. You have a roiv of the water that you need for a mikvah's 40 saw, that's kosher water. U'b'hamshaka, and the minority of the water, the smaller portion of the 40 saw, which is 19 saw, came in with hamshaka. That's Rabbi ben Yaakov saying that rebiyah v'hamshaka, roiv kosher water, and the miyat coming in b'hamshaka, that's okay. So the Gemara says, Michlal the Rabbanan savri the Rabbi u'v'hamshacha loy. The Rabbanan hold that the Rabbi and hamshacha don't work at all. It sounds like it's only Rabbi ben Yaakov who holds that Rabbi and hamshacha work. And if the Rabbanan are arguing with him and saying that hamshacha doesn't work even on only a miyat of the water, Elahodechi asa Ravan am Rabbi Yochanan. Ravan said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, She'uva shem shichua kula toira, that you could even be moishech an entire mikveh of shuvin, 40 saw of mayim shuvin, possible water. You could allow it to flow into the mikveh, and it's toir, money. Who holds that? If Rabbi ben Yaakov requires a rebiyah v'hamshacha, and the Rabbanon don't allow that either, then who will be the opinion of she'uva shem shichua kula toira? So the Gemara seems to be bringing at least two opinions over here. One opinion that rebiyah v'hamshacha works, and one opinion that holds that even she'uva shem shichua kula works. An entire mikveh filled with she'uvin that one brought in through hamshacha is kosher as well. And one more source, let's take a look at the Tosefta. The Tosefta in Perek Daled, Halacha Beis, says Rabbi ben Yaakov Oimer, the same Rabbi ben Yaakov, Gag sheyesh baroisha echad ve'esrim saw shal mei megashamim. You have a rooftop that has 21 saw of megashamim on it. Memala bekatav v'noisen latoicha yutes saw. One could fill with kalim, mayim shuvim, 19 saw, directly into the mayim ksherim, not entering it through hamshacha, but pouring it directly into the mayim ksherim. And then upoiskan uma'arvan upoischoi, then he could let it flow, this arvu b'choter, and he lets it flow on into another place, another mikveh, all the water together after it mixed. He's letting it flow somewhere else. And because the rove of that water was 21 saw mayim ksherim, and only 19 saw was poured in bipsul, that hamshach will allow all of it now to become kosher in the new location where the water will end up being. That's the basic three makoiros to the idea of hamshacha. One makoir was a Mishnah, saying that when water mixes as it flows together toward a mikveh, if roiv was kosher, it's kosher, and if roiv was not, or mechza, it's possible. A Gemara that said that there's the idea of rebiyah v'hamshacha in a mikveh, when you have 21 saw there already, and 19 is coming in independently with hamshacha, that it's kosher. And the Gemara introduced an opinion of she'uva shem shichua kula kshera as well. And then a Tosefta that says that if you had 19 saw come into an existing 21 saw mayim ksherim, and it caused the psul, because when she'uvin enters a mikveh ksheir, it becomes possible, but then all of it flows together into another mikveh, that hamshacha will allow this whole combination to become kosher again. Now, like I said, there's a big machlokes showing them how to understand these three sources. Do we accept all of them? Are all the different methods of hamshacha acceptable, or only one of them? And who holds she'uva shem shichua kshera, kula kshera? Who holds that all of it could become kosher if all 40 saw are nimshach? And this is a big machlokes. The Rambam quotes the Chachmei Ma'ariv, which is the Rif, that hold, according to the opinion, that she'iva shem shichua kula kshera. If you have mayim shuvim and you moishech all of it into a mikveh, it's kosher. And the Rambam writes that I haven't seen anyone do anything like that. I haven't seen anyone be makel with this shita of the Rif, of the Chachmei Ma'ariv. If that would be okay, that all shuvin, any mikveh could be filled with shuvin water as long as you make hamshacha, it would seem that no mikveh would ever be possible. What mikveh would be possible? Just take some water and make sure that it's entering through hamshacha. You don't need any mekshamim, you don't need any meimayin, you don't need anything to be b'dei shemayim. With any kind of hamshacha, everything is good. So the Rambam doesn't take that opinion, although there is such an opinion. The She'iltis is quoted, the B'sheitza brings the She'iltis, that even though we don't paskin that shuva shem shchua kula is actually kshera, and you could toivel in 40 saw that you brought in, 40 saw of mayim shuvim that you brought into a mikveh through hamshacha. But what it does accomplish, even if it's kula shov, 40 saw of Mayim Shuvim that you brought through hamshaka, what it does accomplish is that it's no longer possible. The hamshaka helped, and the water is no longer possible. You can add kosher water to that, another 40 saw of kosher water, and it'll be okay. So essentially, the hamshaka did work on all the she'uvin water together, not to make it kosher to be able to use. It's not valid for tefillah, but it's not anymore possible. It's not considered Mayim Shuvim anymore. It doesn't have the status of Mayim Shuvim, and it won't passel the water that you add on top of it. So those are two opinions, both the Rif and the She'iltas, that do seem to take the idea of she'uva shem shichua kula ksheira quite literal, that all 40 saw could be nimshach and it's kosher. Some Rishonim learn that that's really what it does mean, she'uva shem shichua kula ksheira, but we don't paskin like that. So we're going to paskin that the Rabbi of hamshaka is necessary. You do need a roiv of kosher water, and the opinion that holds that you could use all 40 saw of hamshaka, we don't paskin like that, and we just disregard that opinion la halacha. The Mechaber, quoting a Rambam, is going to paskin that we do require Rabbi of hamshaka, which is what we saw in the Gemara. Rabbi Yankiv requires 21 saw should be kosher water, and only 19 could be used with hamshaka, 19 saw of Mayim Shuvim hamshaka. But the Mechaber, quoting the Rambam, does bring a new interpretation of the idea of she'uva shem shichua kula ksheira, and that is similar to what the Tosefta mentioned, that if you have a rooftop of 21 saw of Mayim ksheira, and you pour 19 saw directly into that, and you made it all possible now. That's the halacha when you pour in Mayim Shuvim into a mikveh chseira. So that's considered 40 saw of Mayim Shuvim. That's she'uva shem shichua kula. By allowing all that to flow into a new mikveh, you just were moishech 40 saw of Mayim Shuvim. That's okay. As long as there was original 21 saw of Mayim ksherim, that's when we're going to paskin, and that's what the Gemara means according to the Rambam. When the Gemara says she'uva shem shichua kula ksheira, you could be moishech 40 saw of Mayim Shuvim, and it will be okay. It wasn't originally 40 saw of Mayim ksherim, of Mayim Shuvim, but it became Mayim Shuvim when the 19 saw of Shuvim was poured into it directly. So that's the different opinions about how and when to apply the idea of hamshaka. Let's see it in the Lashon Mechaber, and see how the Mechaber paskins like Shittas Rambam. The Mechaber is Sif Mem Daldet. Ein hamayim she'uvim poislam es hamikveh begin belugen at sheyiplu l'toich hamikveh me'akeli. Mayim she'uvim will only passel a mikveh chasera, which means if a mikveh does not yet have 40 saw of Mayim ksherim, then Mayim Shuvim will passel it only if it falls directly from the keli into a mikveh. That's the typical case of 3 luging of Mayim Shuvim passeling a mikveh chasera. Avalem nigreru hamayim hashuvim chutz lemikveh. If the Mayim Shuvim came into this mikveh chasera through hamshaka, which means it was dragged on the floor outside the mikveh before entering into the mikveh, it didn't come directly from the keli into the mikveh, but nimshachu v'yardu the mikveh, only after it was nimshach did it go into the mikveh chasera. Einam poislam as hamikveh, they do not passel this mikveh chasera ad sheyu mechza al mechza. Hamshaka that is brought in Mayim Shuvim by hamshaka will only passel when it's mechza al mechza, when the ratio of kosher water and shuvin water that was brought in by hamshaka was half and half. So if you have 20 saw of Mayim ksherim and 20 saw of Mayim Shuvim that was brought in hamshaka, that will passel the mikveh chasera. Avalim hoyu roiv me'ksherim. As long as the roiv of the water was the kosher water, and only a miyat was brought in by hamshaka, harei hamikveh kosher. Then the mikveh will remain kosher. Now, of course, just to remind you, we're talking about a mikveh chasera. A mikveh that has 40 saw of Mayim ksherim, you can add as much shuvim as you want. We already learned that earlier in Sif Tezvav, and Sif Chaf Aleph. You can add as much water as you want, and now it's okay. So a mikveh chasera that doesn't yet have 40 saw and would become possible with Mayim Shuvim that's poured into it, that only applies if it's poured directly from the keli into the mikveh, and not if it was brought in through hamshaka. Keitzad. What's the example of this? Mikveh sheyesh by chafsa u'mashuhu Mayim ksherim. A mikveh that has in it 40 saw and a mashuhu of kosher water. The Mechaber seems to specifically use this example of 20 plus a mashuhu. You don't need 21 saw, but 20 is not either enough. You need 20 and a little more. That's already roiv of mem saw. And somebody was drawing water and filling up kalim of water and pouring in and filling the mikveh, but doing so outside the mikveh. The water was now being nimshach before entering the mikveh. Both if you did this hamshaka on karka, on the ground, or you're doing it on a pipe, or any surface, something that does not pass the mikveh, something that's not makabel tuma, something that's not a keli in its own right, causing a new problem of shuvim, hareyu kosher. The Mechaber paskins that hamshaka could be done both on karka or on anything that's not going to passel the mikveh. Doesn't have to necessarily be on karka. And in that case, when you're adding these 19 saw to the 20 plus, you're adding whatever you still need for the 40 saw, that's kosher. And now, it's so kosher, by the time you got to 40, that vafilu hishlimul elef saw, even if you're going to pour in much more water, it's eventually going to be a roiv that came in the she'uvim b'hamshacha. Up to 1,000 saw. You only started off with 20 plus, and you already added another 1,000 saw, it's still okay. Sha'shuva shem shichua ksheder, because the halacha is that you could be moishech ma'im she'uvim and it's kosher. Im hoya shem roiv mem saw mana kosher. As long as you had the roiv of the mem saw from the kosher water, you could add the miyat of the ma'im she'uvim b'hamshacha, and from there on the mikveh is kosher, and you could even add much more than that miyat once you come to the amount of 40 saw. Now this is the typical case of Rabbi of hamshaka. This is the case that the Gemara brought in the name of Rabbi ben Yaakov. If you have 21 saw in a mikveh, that's kosher, you could add now another 19 b'hamshacha, and if you add 19 b'hamshacha, then the mikveh will now be kosher now that you have those 40 saw. So this is what it looks like. The typical case of hamshacha, where you have 21 saw meg shamim ksherim in the mikveh, and somebody pours from a keli on the karka 3 tvachim away, and it then flows into the mikveh. You could fill that mikveh to 40 saw, the mikveh is kosher, and you could add now, both with hamshacha or even without hamshacha, up to 1,000 saw, and the mikveh will be kosher. That's what a typical case of Rabbi of hamshacha looks like. Now the Mechaber goes on to a next case, which is not anymore the Gemara and Tamura, but this is now the case of the Tosefta. V'chein gag shahoya beroishoy chofsa u'mashahu. A rooftop that had in it ma'im ksherim on top of the roof, 20 saw plus roiv of the mem saw, make shomim. Umile b'kseifoy, which means somebody filled manually with kalim, letoichoy, directly into the ma'im ksherim. Not with hamshach, he poured it directly into the ma'im ksherim, pachas michof, less than chof. In the case that we spoke previously, you can add as much as you want, because by the time you added 19 and a half, there was 40 already, and they all came in through hamshacha, the mikvah is kosher, you could keep on adding water. In this case, you're pouring the water directly into the ma'im ksherim. If you're going to add more than 20, it's not going to be roiv anymore, you won't be able to perform any more hamshacha. But it's talking about a case where you added pachas michof. You had chof u'mashu, you added now pachas michof, and you have now on the rooftop 40 saw of ma'im sulim. By the time you added more than 3 lugim of she'uvim into a mikveh chseira, which essentially that's what there was on the rooftop, it's all pasel now. And the Mechaber specifically says so, shenimtza hakol pasel. You have 40 saw of ma'im she'uvim, essentially. Upasach hatzina, you now opened a tzina, you opened a pipe on the side. Benimshichu hakol l'makam echad. You moishich this entire combination of 40 saw, ma'im sulim, into another place, another mikveh. Harei ze mikveh kosher. Now, once this hamshaka was performed on this 40 saw, the mikveh will be kosher. Why? So this is a lashon Rambam, and the Mechaber is quoting, "Sha'shuva shem shichua kula ksheira." Lashon Gemara. There's an opinion that you could take an entire mikveh of ma'im shuvim, be moishechet, and it's kosher. When do we say that? In such a scenario, where that shuva that was entirely shuvim was really a combination of an original 21 saw of ksherim and a miyat of 19 saw of ma'im shuvim. So even though it all became possible, because that was the ratio of the water that was there, you can now make hamshaka on all of it, and we're going to paskin like that opinion, with this interpretation of the opinion, that shuva shem shichua kula ksheira. Why? Hoyel v'yesham roiv me'akosher. Because roiv of the water was originally kosher, that's why the hamshaka will work on the entire combination of this 40 saw. So now we see that the Mechaber is paskening both like the opinion of Rabbi of hamshaka, when you're adding 19 saw through hamshacha into an existing 21 saw, and if you add the 19 saw directly into the 21 saw, in that case it wouldn't be good anymore because it all became possible, but you could still perform a second hamshacha on the entire combination and let it go into another mikveh. And just to show a picture of what that would look like, you have over here number 1, right? You have 21 saw in the mikveh already, and somebody pouring from a keli another 19 saw of shuvin, which means v'nimtza hakol pasel, it's all pasel. And then you see in picture number 2, where he opens that little pipe, and all the water flows into another mikveh. Because the combination of that water was 21 saw ksherim and 19 saw shuvim, even though it all became she'uvim before he made an hamshaka, that's what we're going to paskin, says the mechaber, she'uva shemshechua kula ksheira. Comes the Ramah, and the Ramah adds an interesting hagah. And this hagah has to be understood correctly. Hagah, avalim himshach tchila mayim sulam, but if one first performed the hamshaka on the miyat of mayim sulam, va'achar kach hevi aleim roiv mayim ksherim, and then he had a roiv of mayim ksherim enter that water. So you have also, again, it's similar to the idea of Rabbi of hamshaka, right? You have roiv, mayim ksherim, and you have hamshaka on a miyat mayim shuvim, but you have it in the wrong order. You don't have Rabbi and then hamshaka, you have first hamshaka and then the Rabbi. Does that work as well? Do we say that because only a miyat of the mayim was mayim shuvim that was nimshach, and roiv of the mayim is mayim ksherim, it works? Or no, the order was specific. The Ramah says the order is specific. Loi mahani. Rabbi of hamshaka only works if you first have a roiv of mayim ksherim, and then you add mayim shuvim b'hamshaka a miyat. If you do it the other way around, it doesn't work. The Ramah says his hagah at the end of the mechaber. After the mechaber already told us there's an idea of making hamshaka on she'uva shemshechua kula ksheira, and the Ramah adds to that there has to be an order. There has to be an order of having the roiv ksherim come in before the miyat of psulim. It would seem that the Ramah means to say that even if you're now going to be moishech all of it, like we just learned in the mechaber at the end, that would neither help. And that's a topic of discussion in the Achroinim. Does the Ramah mean that too? Or does the Ramah only mean that in the first case of the mechaber, where you have a mikveh and you first made hamshaka of 19 saw, and only then it rained in 21 saw, that kind of Rabbi of hamshaka doesn't help. But in the case of she'uva shemshechua kula, where you then make another additional hamshaka on the combination of the water altogether, maybe that would work. There are those that want to say that even though the Ramah says loy mahani, he means loy mahani before you would make a new hamshaka. But we're going to see that the shach will say that the Ramah means to say that even with an additional hamshaka you're going to make on all the water together, it will not work. So let's take a look now at the Taz Sivkot Nun Hey. The mechaber mentioned the lashon al shiyu mechza al mechza, and we saw it in the Mishna already. The Mishna also used, interestingly, the lashon of mechza al mechza. It's not something we find often in mikvahs because, first of all, it's hard to figure out what really means mechza al mechza. How do you have exactly half of the water? But in general, we know that if you need roiv, you need roiv. But the Mishnah says specifically that if you have roiv and aksherim, then Rabbi of hamshaka works. If you have roiv and apsulim, not. And mechza al mechza, also not. So the Taz, quoting a lashon natur, betur kosov, dem ein boy ela chof soin. If you only have 20 saw of mayim ksherim, v'shoav chof soin, and you add another 20 saw of she'uvin, afil al yedei hamshaka. The 20 saw was added with hamshaka. Possible. That mixture is possible. Why is it possible? Well, based on what it says in the mechaber, mechza al mechza, that's possible. If you have 20 saw ksherim and 20 saw b'hamshaka, that's possible. You need a rebia b'hamshaka. Nire borer, the psul zeh habe kamoy pissul she'iva. The Taz says there's a typical psul of shuvim. 20 saw came in. This water is just as possible as any other shuvim, just like any shuvim that you pour in directly, 3 lugn into a mikveh chseira. The whole entire mikveh now becomes possible. The same thing happens when you have 20 coming in b'hamshacha because you don't have the roiv anymore. It's like any shuvim that passes the mikveh chseira. Dem nafel gimel lugn shuvim, just like if 3 lugn of shuvim falls in, the intakona, there's no way to fix that mikveh. Rak achar sheyatzu rashonim, unless you're going to flush out the water and replace it with new water. The halacha we learned earlier, which he quotes, the halacha is that if 3 lugn of shuvim enter a mikveh chseira, the only way to make that mikveh kosher again, you can't just take out 3 lugn, and you can't just fill up the mikveh with the rest of whatever was missing. You have to actually pour in new water and have some of the old water leave. It's called maloya v'oid. We learned about it earlier, to make sure that the original amount of water leaves. So if there's 20 saw and you added 3 lugn, you have to make sure that 20 plus a little bit leave, so that we can make believe we assume that all the original 20 saw that became puzzle with a little bit of the 3 lugn as well left the mikveh, and now the new water will become kosher. But if you don't do that, the mikveh remains puzzle. And if that's the case, over here as well, if you have 20 saw mayim shuvim coming in b'hamshacha into 20 saw of mayim ksherim, the only way to fix that would be now, because you don't have a roiv anymore, would be to flush out the water. How much? You would actually have to flush out almost an entire 40 saw. Because you have 20 saw of the original water that was there, another 20 saw of shuvim that came in. You have to get it down to just be less than 3 lugn left of the mayim shuvim that came in, and you'd have to pour out. You have to make sure you're flushing out quite a bit of water in order to make that kosher again. So what the Taz is quoting the Torah is saying is that when we say Rabbi of hamshaka needs a roiv of ksherim, it's specifically a roiv. And if it's anything less than roiv, even if it's mechza al mechza, it will be considered as if nothing was done differently than a typical case of shuvin entering a mikveh seder. The fact that it came on hamshaka has no significance. And in order to make it kosher, again, you're going to have to do whatever you would do when shuvin gets poured into a mikveh seder. Now the Taz continues and asks a question from a later Sif Nun Hey, where we find again the idea of hamshaka mentioned. And over there it does seem that hamshaka will work even when there was only 20 saw, and not 21. Not a roiv of the mem saw, ma'am ksherim that we require. V'leidomi the Sif Nun Hey, the mashov be'emtza, a case where the shov is be'emtza. So let me show you what this looks like, shov be'emtza. The halacha in Sif Nun Hey is talking about 3 mikvois, one near another, each one that only have 20 saw. 20 saw, 3 mikvois of 20 saw each. 20 saw obviously is only half a mikveh. It's one boiler near the other. The outside rim around all 3 boilers are high enough that even if the water level rises higher than the wall in between these boilers, the 2 dividing walls, the water won't leave. They'll just combine. It will become one big mixture of 60 saw. So the halacha is that if 3 people go into the mikveh, and when the 3 people enter the mikveh, the water level rises because they went into the mikveh, and now you have 60 saw together. What's the halacha now? And the Mechaber says that if you have the 2 mikvois, one near another, the two that are near each other are both ksherim, and the one on the side is shov, and 3 people go in, and the water level rises. So the 2 mikvois that were ksherim, 20 saw each, touched each other, you had 40 saw on contact, that becomes kosher, and they're touching as well the 20 saw of she'uvim, that becomes kosher. And now when the 3 people leave the mikveh, those 3 people became toir if they toiveled in the water while it was touching, and the water, after it falls down again, it's still mikveh chaseder because each one only has 20 saw. They can't be used as is, but they're all kosher. Because even the shov was contacting the 2 mikvahs ksherim that were 20 each, and they were mitzvah to be a kosher mikveh. If, however, the 2 mikvahs that were ksherim were on the 2 sides, and the one in the middle was shov, and 3 people go into those mikvahs, and the water level rises, so you didn't have 40 saw of kosher water on contact, touching each other, so they didn't become kosher. So the people toiveling in them didn't toivel in 40 saw that are ksherim. And when they leave, if they were tameh, those people, then they remain tameh, and the water remains as is. The water goes back down, the 20 saw on this side go back, and it's 20 saw of ksherim, the 20 saw in the middle go down, and it's 20 saw of she'uvim, and the 20 saw on the other side go down, and the ksherim. The question is, why didn't some of the she'uvim water that entered each of the 20 saw of ksherim make it possible? Each one of those 20 saw of ksherim are mikveh seder. If you have, all you need is 3 lugan of she'uvim to fall into them and they become possible. So why do we say that they remain ksherim? Are we assuming that none of the water from the mikveh shov went into the kosher water? So the Taz is asking, why does that case work? Now the answer over there that we give why they didn't become possible is because the water fell into the mikveh kosher with hamshaka. The water flowed over that wall. The water of the she'uvim flowed over the wall into the kosher mikveh, and that's called hamshaka. It didn't fall directly in from the top, it flowed over the wall, which is some kind of hamshaka, and that's why it didn't passel the kosher water. The question is that if there was only 20 saw ksherim, why is that different than the case of the tur, where he says that 20 saw ksherim into which you add water b'hamshaka, 20 saw of she'uvim, is no good. So why over there is it good? This is what the Taz's question is, and he explains that the mashoyev be'emtza, even when the she'uvim is the one in the middle, the outside mikvois remain kosher just like they were. They didn't become possible from the she'uvim water from the middle that entered them. Why? The Halachos of Hamshocho beheter. That hamshaka was done beheter. That wasn't similar to the Torah's hamshaka of 20 soma'im shuvim coming in hamshaka that was done bipsul. So then why do we say that one cannot toivel in those mikvois? They're still possible because they're still a mikvah chaser. There's only 20 saw over there, you can't use them. And they're also possible because they didn't become the middle one that was getting in the way, didn't let the 2 outer mikvois connect. So there was at no point 40 saw of ksherim. The people that entered those mikvois didn't become tahir. The middle mikvah didn't become ma'am ksherim. And all you're left with again is a mikvah chaser that was kosher. So whoever entered those mikvois didn't become tahir. But the hamshaka was bekashrus. Masha'enken kan over here hamshaka be'isr, adding 20 saw ma'am she'uvim hamshaka, that's considered an isser if it's not being done right, Rabbi hamshaka. You don't have rov ksherim, you had mechza, kein nirali. The Taz is a bit unclear about why do we consider over there that the hamshaka was done bekashrus and beheter, and over here it's bepsul. But he is saying that in the Torah's example, chaf and chaf, that's mechza, not Rabbi hamshaka. The simple understanding is that over there, being that only a little bit of the water that was shov, not a 20 saw, is entering into the mayim ksherim, so it's only a miyut. It's considered the Rabbi hamshaka. There are many that understand the Taz to be implying that even if all you had was chaf saw ksherim, you didn't have chaf aleph, you didn't have roiv mem saw, you only had chaf saw, which is not roiv mem saw. But if the amount of she'uvin entering by hamshacha was less than that, so that also was considered the Rabbi of hamshacha. Roiv of the water that's kosher was the amount of water that was kosher was more than the amount of hamshacha that was being brought in, the mayim she'uvin. So we would say Rabbi of hamshacha even if there wasn't roiv mem saw ksherim, as long as the combination was roiv mayim ksherim. And if that's the case, we don't have to have an example of chaf saw, we could even have an example of 10 saw, as long as the she'uvin that you're bringing in hamshacha was less than that. Interestingly, the lashon of the mechaber was specifically im hoyesham roiv mem saw min hakosher. Now some say that that's also not specific. The mechaber is just trying to give an example where the mixture ends up being 40 saw. So if you want that, you have to have roiv mem saw min hakosher and a miyut being added, and then you have a mikveh kosher. But there's a big machloikus in the achroinim. If when the mechaber says chafsa ul mashu, that's the example he gives for Rabbi of hamshacha, is that specific? And anything less than chafsa ul mashu won't help hamshacha, even if what you're adding is only a miyut of the water less than the amount of ksherim, or no, you need chaf sa ul mashu. Anything less than that won't work, even if the mayim shuvim that's entering is less than that. And there are those that bring a raya from this Taz that he seems to imply that even if you don't have chaf ul mashu, as long as the mayim ksherim is more than shuvim coming in hamshacha, that's still okay. Others explain that the reason why over there in Sif Nun Hey it's considered to be beheter is because the water mixes before it comes in. It's not purely mayim shuvim coming in by hamshacha. The water, when they touch, some of the kosher water mixed with some of the pasla water, and then they came in. And that would be a little similar to the Mishnah we discussed, where the water is mixed before they enter into the mikveh. And if that's the case, then it's already different than mayim shuvim that just enters on its own into a mikveh. And maybe that's why even if there was only chaf saw, and generally we do require chaf aleph saw, but being that it came in betaruvas, maybe that's why it's okay. In any case, we find clearly that the Taz is saying that mechza is a problem, and that in Sif Nun Hey, even though over there was only chaf saw, it's a different kind of hamshacha, it was done beheter, and that's why we say that the mayim remained ksherim. V'liyadana ma choshev aprisha. The Taz continues, and he brings a shittas aprisha. He says, I don't know what the prisha is saying. Lahachshir kan be'im yikove al zem meik shamim. If you have, in the case of the Tur, chaf saw ksherim, you have 20 saw kosher in the mikveh, and then you have another 20 saw coming b'hamshacha. You don't have a Rabbi hamshacha, it's no good. But the Prisha says that it's taka no good. It's not mayim ksherim yet, but if it will rain onto that more meik shamim, that will still be okay. In other words, even without the Rabbi hamshacha, you don't have the roiv, so it's not really ksherim, but it's not psulim either. It's not mayim shuvim. Halachos of Hamshocho would be that even if it would rain into that another 40 saw, or another 1,000 saw, it wouldn't be good. Because it came onto mayim shuvim. But in this case, being that it came into water that wasn't shuvim anymore, even if it wasn't ksherim, it's enough that the added water will be kosher. And that's similar to a shiltas that we mentioned earlier, who says that even 40 saw b'hamshacha is not kosher yet, but it's no longer possible and you can add water to it. But this is the idea that the Prisha is saying, and the Taz disagrees. The Taz says, "V'liyadana ma choshev b'Prisha." I don't understand this. The Za'ena l'fiyan yizdati. The Taz holds that if the Riyah of Hamshacha wasn't performed correctly, like he said earlier, it's a typical case of she'uvin. You're going to have to actually flush out the water. Just like you would do if three lugn of she'uvin enter a mikvah seder in order for it to be kosher. Let's take a look at the Shach. The Shach in Sif Kot and Tzadik Vov. Achiyu mechza al mechza. Rabbi of Hamshacha is only when it's roiv, but if it's only a mechza al mechza, it's possible. V'kolshken roiv she'uvim. Of course, if the she'uvim is roiv, then of course she'poislim b'hamshacha, the incoming she'uvim that is a roiv coming in b'hamshacha, of course passes the mikveh. Because of Abach, Sif Chavo, b'shem Aravid, he quotes Abach that's quoting Aravid, Dahainu davke himshach b'kavana. When do we say that you need a Rabbi of Hamshacha? And if you don't have roiv mayim ksherim, Hamshacha on mayim shuvim won't work. That's only if you're moishach b'kavana. Somebody has a mikvah seder, 21 saw, and he wants the toivel in it, but he doesn't have 40 saw. So bekavana, intentionally, he takes another 19 saw and he adds it into the mikvah hamshaka. If you're doing it intentionally to make the water kosher, then you can only do it as long as it's a miyat of the water. Aval shaloi bekavana. If it's being done unintentionally, somebody by mistake kicked over a bucket and there was mayim shuvim there and it wasn't done intentionally, and the water flowed into the mikvah hamshaka, then afilu kule hamshaka ksheira. Even if an entire mikvah filled with mayim shuvim that was brought hamshaka, but it was done unintentionally, if that's the case, it's kosher. Ayin sham. Vayin lel sof sif tezvav. That's where this Ravid is mentioned. So the Shach is quoting a Ravid that's saying that the Rabbi of hamshaka is only required this condition and this ratio in order to make hamshaka valid. Having a roiv ksherim is only if it's done bekavana. If it wasn't done bekavana, then we're going to allow even kula b'hamshaka. Nachroinim take issue with this Shach, who seems to be relying on a big kula of the Bach to allow shuva shemshichu kula under this condition of shlei bekavana, and they say that the Ravid only says it regarding Sif Tezvav actually, where the mayim shuvim wasn't real mayim shuvim. The Ravid wasn't referring to water that was collected in a keli that became real mayim shuvim. He's referring to water that somebody brought by hand or hands or feet of an animal. So that's not considered real mayim shuvim. It's still bidei adam and still has to become kosher with hamshaka, but that's when we say a kula of shlei bekavana, you can fill an entire mikveh with that. But water that was in a keli, for that kind of water, we always require Rabbi of hamshaka. We do find some of the Achronim mentioning for a tziruf to be mekel on the Bach, who says Shalei B'Kavana will help sometimes when necessary, but in general, the Achronim understand that the kula of the Bach b'Shem Aravid is only going to be valid when we're talking about shuvin that was not collected in a keli. Sifkat and Tzadik Zayim, Midvarim She'en and Poislim. The Mechaber allows hamshaka to be done on karka or on anything that doesn't pass the mikveh. We're not noyeg like that to allow hamshaka on half a pipe or something as long as it's not makabel tuma. Alabina hamshaka al gabe karka sheroy levloya. Kedlakama sif manvov chen kasav abach. We're going to soon learn in sif manvov that the best way to make hamshaka, and the Ramah says that it's toiv lahachmel lechatchila to make hamshaka only on karka haroy levloya, only on ground, on earth that can actually absorb the water. That's where the hamshaka is valid. If you're doing it on anything else that doesn't absorb water and it's not the ground, that we don't allow the hamshaka to be done. And we're going to learn about that in Sif Manvav, and that's why today we use some kind of cement or different things that are considered karka roy levloya in order to make hamshaka. Shach Sifkot and Tzadik Ches Shenim Tzahakol Posel. The Mechaber mentioned clearly that if you have a rooftop of 21 saw ksherim and you add by hand directly into it 19 saw of shuvin, all of it is now possible. Why? Because you added the mayim shuvin directly into a mikveh. And the halacha is that if you add mayim shuvim into a mikveh more than 3 lugen, a mikveh chseira, it's possible. You didn't add it b'hamshaka. If you would have added it b'hamshaka into a mikveh chseira, as long as it's a miyat, it would be okay. But you added it directly into the mikveh. Still, even though it all became possible, if you make hamshaka on the entire combination, the entire mixture of that water, it still will become kosher because the roiv of it was mena kosher. Shach Sivkot and Tzadik Tes. Avol. Now he's referring to the Ramah. The Ramah says the Rabbi of hamshaka has to be done in the right order. And if it was first the miyat b'hamshaka and then the roiv ksherim, that wouldn't help anymore. Lo mahani. Pirish shemshach tchila mayim shuvim lemikveh. If you first added the mayim shuvim into the mikveh b'hamshaka, ve'enam chavsa, and it's not yet chavsa, which automatically it's now a miyat of the memsa. Now you added, let's say, another 21 saw of mayim ksherim, so you have 40 saw, which essentially you have a roiv mayim ksherim, and only a miyat was shuvim b'hamshaka, but because it was done in the wrong order, the way the ksherim was added was that it rained in. Obviously, you can't bring that mayim ksherim. That would be a problem, causing a new problem of shuvim. Lo mahani. It doesn't help. That mikveh is not kosher. Not just is it not kosher now on its own, but afilu in posach achar kachatzina. Even if you open the pipe and allow that entire mikveh, you're going to allow it all to flow into another mikveh, which is similar to the second case of the mechaber of the rooftop, where we say the idea of shuv shemshichu kula ksheira. We don't say in this case that you can make the entire mikveh now kosher with hamshaka. We only say that when there was originally roiv mayim ksherim, and then the miyat came in, and it made it possible, and then all that psulim together, you could make hamshaka to another mikveh. But if there was first the miyat shuvim and then the roiv ksherim, it won't even help to make an entire hamshaka on all of the water into another mikveh. That's how the Shach learns the Ramah, Lemahani, even with a new hamshaka. And like we mentioned, this is the machloikus and the achronim, if that's actually the intention of the Ramah, to say that a new hamshaka won't either help or Lemahani as is. Let's just review some of this in the slides. Making shuvin water kosher and valid again. It's like we said, the term hamshaka is something we refer to often in Hilchos Mikvois, how to correct a psul of shuvin or any other puzzle of water, making it kosher. Right? You let it flow on the ground before it goes into the mikveh, it becomes kosher. So even water that was collected intentionally in a keli, with all the conditions that do make water into mayim shuvin, we learned about it in Sif Tezvav and in Sif Lamed Daled, Lamed Hey, different conditions, how it was collected with kavana, it becomes shuvin. It's invalid for a mikveh. But if you make the hamshaka on that, it will become valid again. Having it flow on the ground or on something that's not a keli, according to the mechaber, that would be good. And the reasoning, the Rosh explains, is because the problem of shuvin is that it's tolish, is disconnected from the ground, is disconnected from how it was naturally, and by causing it to flow over the ground, the hamshaka is similar to the concept of zriya. Zriya means that you could add pasla water into kosher water of memsa, and it becomes nizra, it becomes kosher. You can make zriya on the ground, and when you let it flow over the ground, that's considered a zriya, that makes it again connected to the ground. Now there's different opinions in the Gemara, we said, of Rabbi of Hamshocho and Hamshocho kuloi. The idea of Rabbi of Hamshocho is obviously that you first need roiv ksherim and only make on the miyat, the Hamshocho, to kasher the mayim shuvim. Hamshocho kuloi would mean, the simple understanding would mean that you could do an entire Hamshocho on all of the mayim shuvim and it would be a kosher mikveh. Like we said, the machlokes are showing what that means. What kind of shuvim could you do Hamshocho on the entire 40 so? So, la halacha, the way the mechaber explained by the Taz is that when you have more than 20 saw already in the mikveh, you could add the miyat b'hamshacha, the mayim shuvim, and it will become kosher. And once you have the 40 saw, the combination of 21 of the original mayim ksherim and 19 of the mayim shuvim that came in b'hamshacha, you can now add whatever you want, and the rest of the water will be kosher, like the mechaber said, up to 1,000 saw. The Prisha said that if there was half and half, which we know is not good, and the Torah says it's not good means you can't toivel in it. It's not mayim ksherim yet, but you could add more water to it and it will be kosher. The Shach quotes a Bach, we said, who says that if it's done unintentionally, the hamshaka will be good even without the rebiyah of mayim ksherim. Kula b'hamshaka, as long as it was done shlei b'kavana, will still be kosher. And Rabbi Kiva Eger and other achronim say that that's only referring to water that was not collected in a keli, and only if it was done just by hand, that's when the Bach and the Ravid are mekel on shlei b'kavana being allowed for all the water, but if not, it would still be necessary to have a rebiyah of hamshaka roiv mayim ksherim, even if it's being done shlei b'kavana. Hamshaka on an entire mikveh of kula hamshaka, we said according to the Rambam, the way the Mechaber paskins, if a minority of the shuvin was added without hamshaka into a majority of mayim ksherim, even directly, and it all became possible, you could then make all the water together be nimshach into another mikveh, and it will become kosher. The Ramah adds that that's only if the water was first brought, the mayim ksherim, and then into that was poured the mayim shuvim. That's when we say that you can do the idea of shuv shem shechua kula and make it kosher. But if you first had the mayim shuvim come in, even b'hamshacha, then it wouldn't help anymore to have an additional mayim ksherim come in. You can't even make hamshacha on that anymore. Rabbi of hamshacha is specifically if the mayim ksherim came in before the mayim sulam was entered into the mikveh.